Hello, my name is Bob James, Dr. Bob James from Australia. I want to talk briefly with you today about a problem facing Freemasonry. Here in New South Wales, and I believe elsewhere, debate about the steady loss of Mason numbers over recent decades has centred on how well Freemasonry fits within modern society. Various interpretations of today's world have been offered up and various statistics have been brought to bear. I guess the most common interpretation is that if only certain influences of modern society could somehow be overcome, then Freemasonry could continue its work of making good men better. And if only candidates were not distracted, Masons would be truer, more brotherly, more righteous, and the problem of apathy and indifference would disappear. Statistics showing changes in the average age of members and in retention rates have been widely debated. I've heard and seen it argued that if somehow candidates who do not already have a high level of formal education can be excluded, for example, then the problem will disappear. These many views about the future of Freemasonry themselves have some brethren saying that the very disputation is proof of the order's health, not a problem. Within the craft, it seems to me, and its offshoots, there is a deep sense of unease which remain untouched by any of these suggestions. Whatever specific short-term reasons they point to for their anxiety, many brethren see a substantial gap between the potential of Freemasonry and its practice. Many of those who have left the fraternity have said that this is the reason they won't be back. You and I both know that behind those who've walked out altogether there are many frustrated brethren close to leaving or in the process of just drifting away. Now, working my way through various contributions to the debate time and again, I've finished up asking myself whether the right question was yet on the table. Just what is the real problem? My background is as an educator, and for the last 25 years or so I've been researching the history of Freemasonry and other fraternal societies, and after what I think is a reasonable amount of time, I've come to the belief that the problem is internal. It seems to me that Freemasonry has covered up failings in its practice by insisting that its theory and its practice are the same thing. The organisation today desperately fears open discussion of itself. In fact, it has no mechanisms for really doing so, and is therefore unable to even address internal problems, except on occasion behind closed doors, which is never a satisfactory solution. Now, I believe a fundamental rethink of Masonic education is what's required. Brethren need an understanding of Masonic practice, not what the theory says Freemasonry is, or what the theory says Masons should do, but what flesh and blood Masons actually do and have done in real life. As it stands at the moment, it seems any kind of rethink is unlikely. Freemasonry, the organisation, is in denial, and I'm so disillusioned with what I observe around me, I'm ready to walk. I want to talk about the problem as I see it in more detail, and as an example of what I mean by theory, I offer this from the 19th century brother Albert Pike. Freemasonry is a system of morality and wisdom, both practical and speculative. Truth is its centre, the eternal point, pointing out to its disciples not only a knowledge of the great architect of the universe and the moral laws which he has ordained for their guidance, but of those useful arts and sciences which alone distinguish civilized man from his uninformed savage brother. These are not the words that most would choose today, and the reason is obvious. They no longer sound appropriate. They don't reflect the society in which you and I practice our Freemasonry. The appropriate words in which to express the theory have changed, because the society around Freemasonry has changed. But notice that Brother Pike says Freemasonry is. He's disguising theory to look like practice, as though wherever Freemasonry exists you will find morality and wisdom automatically. Freemasonry, the organisation, hopes that words like systems of morality and wisdom already mean something to brethren. If asked, an answer is quoted from the appropriate book, but this is no longer good enough. These words and ideas need to be taught not from the Bible or by symbols and allegory, but by reference to what brethren already know, the real world of people, relationships, real families, real history. I guess there are brethren today who would put forward these words of Brother Pike, or similar words to describe what Freemasonry is, as though perfection was not only possible but had already been achieved. But we all know that however good lodge practice might be, it will never match theory, no matter which definition is used. But if modern Masonry wanted to take the first step and decided it did want to learn from this theory of Brother Pike, brethren would need to discuss at the very least what is meant by systems of morality and wisdom today, and what is the difference between practical and speculative today. What is the nature of truth, especially Masonic truth? What is meant by the centre of truth and the eternal point? How disciples and the great architect communicate? How God's moral laws are known? What the useful arts and sciences were in the 19th century and what they are in 2010. A more modern attempt to disguise theory as practice was made recently in this jurisdiction, New South Wales. I quote, "Freemasonry is practiced in a cooperative democratic manner, with each jurisdiction being able to practice the craft in a way that meets its own needs and objectives without having specific rules and practices imposed on it by a world head office." Unquote. Again, the theory begins with Freemasonry is, and implies that lodge practice is the same as the theory. But let's say modern Masons decided they wanted to look at this theory, perhaps to see whether they matched up. They would have to, at the very least, need to discuss cooperatives. What are they? How do they work? Are there different kinds? And the same with democracy. Why do these words change? How autonomous jurisdictions, which do exist, say in Scotland, actually meet local needs and objectives. And lastly, whether Freemasons today still prefer hierarchical structures over more involvement and more flexibility. It simply is the case that the world has changed mightily in 300 years, and it's not accidental that statements of the theory of Freemasonry have changed, and this in itself should be enough to show that Freemasonry needs to change. The fact that theory is used repeatedly in places of practice tells us that Freemasonry has no mechanisms for adapting to change, even if it wanted to. The fact that no discussion takes place of any theory, new or old, shows how little regard Freemasonry has for even its own truth. So when I call for change, I'm not talking technology, virtual lodges and the like. I'm talking about putting life into the most basic Masonic ideas. The notion of democracy for many people today is not the log cabin to White House notion, which was so revolutionary in the 18th and 19th centuries. However fundamental a shift it was back then to make possible the advancement of a lowly brother to the heights of power, democracy today means far more. It means participation in decision-making, transparency of decision-making processes, and accountability for one's actions. Individual Masons do not like looking at their own practice, and Freemasonry, the organisation, does not like looking at its own practice. Whatever reviews and surveys and reforms are suggested, there are always taboo subjects, areas not to be discussed, either because they are claimed to be landmarks, because they are the essentials of Freemasonry, or simply because Masonic culture insists that brothers will always be polite to one another, not ask hard questions, and so on. Entrenched power and corruption are inevitable wherever leadership groups are not exposed to full scrutiny, whatever the organisation. Now, I don't know whether any corruption exists within Masonic circles, but the potential exists, and as in any organisation, checks and balances could and should be in place. But it's not necessary that there be corruption for Freemasonry to be in its present situation. There are at least two major, perfectly legitimate and understandable reasons, which are faith and inertia. When Masons are asked that most popular of questions, what is Freemasonry, and they give an answer in terms of the theory, they are saying that the authentic past, Freemasonry's authentic past, is irrelevant to the organisation's present and its future. The claim that it is a peculiar system of morality veiled in allegory and illustrated by symbols is also designed to deflect attention away from the fact that whatever else it is, Freemasonry is a social phenomenon with a particular context. That is, it has a location in actual time and space. Freemasonry does not like being reminded of this reality and has repeatedly found ways around it. but the usefulness of sidestepping its authentic past has slowly diminished as society has changed. But in various places the techniques for sidestepping are persistent because it is claimed they serve a higher purpose, as in Albert Pike's 19th century words that the objective of Freemasonry has been, quote, to lead us to the absolute, the final unity in which all things merge, unquote. So before anyone gets too excited, let me make clear I'm not about to deny or to contradict any part of the religious basis of Freemasonry. What I'm urging is that we understand the role religion has played in the evolution of the order in real time, and the changes which have occurred in the treatment of different truths, scientific or historical truth and religious truth. The motto, brotherly love, relief and truth, appears to be relevant here, but when was the last time that you heard Masonic truth raised, let alone seriously discussed? The godly, as I've heard them called within Freemasonry, believe that the truth of Freemasonry is already contained within Masonic practice and needs only persistent study of what I'm calling the theory for it to be found. Now this may well have a lot of truth about it, but all new Freemasons are told that every brother is allowed, indeed encouraged, to find his own way. I've personally seen both godly and ungodly brethren react as though any other truth than theirs is not only wrong, but to be shut down as soon as possible, and not given even the oxygen of a fair discussion. They therefore censor, prohibit, disqualify, and otherwise prevent attempts which they consider not for the good of the craft, to use one formulation. In this they have crossed from tolerance to repression, from brotherhood and truth into self-interested politics. Fear of disunity has driven the no politics, no religion rules in the past, but the godly and the ungodly have both been prominent in recent times amongst those working to prevent discussion. The closing down process doesn't have to be directly engineered or be down to any one group. It can happen naturally, if not guarded against. So when discussion of 300 years of Masonic practice is ignored and discussion of possibilities is not encouraged, not only do memberships plummet, but Masonic culture narrows. It becomes unhealthy and susceptible to factional pressures and personal vendetta. There's a great deal more to being or becoming a Mason than any statement of theory that we might choose. There are skills needed to do it in real life. Freemasonry has refused to see that the skills and the information needed have changed as the society around Freemasonry has changed, and it has refused to acknowledge that at times in its past mistakes have been made. Even if honest, upright, grand officers allowed that just possibly there may have been the odd mistake or the wrong direction chosen, they wouldn't know where to start to gather useful information because they know so little about the past of their own mother lodge, let alone the broader Masonic situation. This is not just because Masonic education has been a dead letter, but because virtually all of the Masonic histories which have been written to this point are fundamentally flawed. This, by the way, is the subject of my paper to the International Conference on Freemasonry 2011. Now, the important result of this policy of avoidance is not just that Brother Brown or Brother Smith gets away with being a fumbler, or even that lodge numbers are losing the best and the brightest. The important end result is that Freemasonry is not able to learn from its own past. It is not able to renew and refresh itself. Freemasonry has failed to educate and is now attempting to make a virtue out of an accumulation of ignorance, what we in Australia call a "she'll be right, mate" attitude, perhaps more commonly known as a heads in the sand, or a see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil approach. I believe that the problem is now obvious. Freemasonry is unable to fix its internal problems because it refuses to acknowledge that there are any, and it refuses to learn from past experience. I would hazard a guess that there's no other organisation that so deludes itself that it makes a policy of not studying its own past experiences. Even today, when there are some small signs of movement, the overall culture remains toxic to learning. Masonic history is barely tolerated as the rather strange hobby of a small group, It might be presented occasionally in lodge as entertainment or as ego massage, but it's not allowed to become a lesson from which modern Masonry might learn. So as a young Mason, I'm very disillusioned with much that I've seen inside the tent, not just locally in this jurisdiction, but elsewhere. I've seen some good things, of course, too, but in general the levels of ignorance, apathy and indifference have been hardest to accept. And to that list I now have to add hypocrisy. As an educator, I'm most disappointed by the fact that Freemasonry doesn't seem to take any learning seriously. Since the 18th century, Freemasons, as you know, have given lip service at least to the aim to diffuse light, that is, to spread knowledge among men, or, they say, to perfect the human race, or through religion and science to bring men into relation with the Absolute, or the cultivation and improvement of the human mind. These all have to do with gaining understanding through searching and through learning. One might be forgiven for thinking that curiosity, openness and an ambition to develop oneself and the organisation by building on past achievements would be essential attributes demanded of all candidates. A well-known 20th century version of this principle is, quote, "We are taught as Freemasons that the purpose of the chisel is to smooth and prepare the stone for the hands of the more expert craftsman, and that as a symbol it points out the advantages of education, by which means alone we are rendered fit members of regularly organised society." Unquote. Now, there can be no clearer statement of the connection between Freemasonry and education. Note the assertion that by no other means can Freemasonry achieve its stated goals. The author, Bernard Jones, goes on to explain that the perfect ashlar, smoothed and squared, symbolises the cultured and educated man, a man having a social conscience. In other words, being a Freemason in Jones's terms equals being cultured, educated and having a social conscience. You can't achieve that from just the theory. Now, I've found that when asked about Masonic education, many Masons quote a statistic that they've heard somewhere, that only 1% of Masons are interested in Masonic education broadly defined, and only 1% of them do anything about it. If this is true, which out of 100 men is actually a Freemason? Freemasonry, the organisation, doesn't seem to care that this statistic is probably true, and it doesn't seem to care that many men who've paid good money to join up have left again, believing that they've been shortchanged. Does it make any sense for Freemasonry to attract candidates on the basis that they are going to be led on a journey of learning and then not deliver? Is it either fair or sensible that 99% of the men who are accepted as real Freemasons, but are not given as a matter of course a systematic, serious and substantial Masonic education, are then dismissed with, they wouldn't be interested anyway? What is it that makes up Freemasonry for someone who believes that being a brother has nothing to do with Masonic education? Is it the ritual, the South, the charity work, the acting in executive positions? Is there anything else? I do want to be fair here, but the only way that it is possible to be involved with any of these elements of Freemasonry without engaging in the sort of learning I'm talking about is by rote, learning the words off by heart, parroting them and then forgetting them, and we all know that this is what happens. And then it's accepted as Masonic success. How has it come about that many men believe that they can parrot certain words, ignore real learning, and still call themselves Freemasons? Now, a glance at Masonic history reveals that this issue of Masonic education has been raised over and over again, and just as often ignored or pushed away into a committee. It's not a new problem. What is new is that Freemasonry is running out of time in which to act. My conclusion is brief. It is Freemasonry itself which has created the problem of its diminished empire. And if our 300 years of experience tells us anything, it is that good theories cannot be wished into good practice. Peace, harmony, brotherhood, compassion, integrity do not fall out of the sky. People's habits do not change just because we want them to change. and in never having a systematic mandatory program of Masonic education, decision makers were bound to produce crises in membership. It was inevitable that frustration, confusion and disappointment would result from the business model currently in place. We all live the reality, yet many continue asserting that Freemasonry is its theory and that it therefore stands in a category of its own, somehow outside time and space. The lack of engagement with basic issues, with Masonic reality, leads to meaningless, useless platitudes such as men need to step up and live Masonically, whatever that means. And of course there are plenty of brethren engaged in shadow boxing, insisting we just need to do what we have been doing, but do it better. Brethren, until we understand how the beached whale, which is Freemasonry today, came to be where it is, it will remain beached. Thank you.